Sometimes that's problematic, as when you're on daylight savings time and we're not there yet. But for me, it's important to start with my orientation, where I am. I'm now your Tiferet B'nai Zion, and I'm Noam Zion in Zion. When I look out my window, I can see the Dead Sea and over the mountains of Jordan. When I look literally across the street, then there is the largest American flag that you can imagine, because that's where the US Embassy is now located, across the street from my house. And that location is very important to me because 73 years ago, when my father and mother, my father was a conservative rabbi, an egalitarian conservative rabbi, who, along with my mother, came to Israel in November 1947, and they joined the Haganah, which was the illegal. It began as the civil defense, and it became the Israeli army. And my father and mother were both stuck with my father's army unit in the neighborhood we're in, Talpiot. And he actually organized the Seder 73 years ago, just before the state of Israel came into existence, at this little pension, this little hotel, which has now been destroyed and replaced by the US Embassy. And after my father passed away, we discovered the original little paper Haggadah that all the soldiers received for Pesach. And my father, as a good educator, wrote into that little Haggadah several different principles, educational principles in Hebrew, by which he would lead this Seder for the soldiers. So the first thing he wrote, and these are quite interesting, he wrote, the Av HaSeder, the leader of the Seder, will be S.Y. Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who was a resident of Talpiot, one of the few residents who was left in the neighborhood, which was an area of on the border fighting between Arab and Jewish neighborhoods. He invited him to come over. He later became the first Israeli Nobel Prize winner, winning the prize for literature. So my father's first great idea for a Seder was have a famous man and incredibly talented in humanities, and he would lead the Seder and he would contribute. Unfortunately, my father discovered that sometimes the smartest people are not the best at leading Seders, and he said the Seder was quite boring. Most of the soldiers didn't know Hebrew. He, Agnon, spoke in an Eastern European heavy accent with Hebrew words that nobody understood. My father loved it, but that wasn't the best choice he made. The second thing my father wrote down is to tell everybody, don't finish all the wine after the first cup. Later on, I asked my father, how did that direction go? He said, Gornish helfen, it didn't help at all. The soldiers, bottles of wine, they wouldn't stop after the first cup. There wasn't much left for the fourth cup. The third thing he wrote down was, everybody at the Seder should bring something from their Seder, their musical traditions, and everybody would sing something different at the Seder. So first of all, you can see my father's tremendous concern for multiculturalism back in 1948, and that was typical of my father. But it was also a very good technique because my father was a monotone. And if he had sung, it would have been a total loss. So he was always good at getting other people to bring the talents to complement what he was missing, which of course is an important principle for your Seders, especially Seders in which you won't have all that many people at your Seder. You have to think about what are the strengths that you have, and also what are the strengths they have, and use those strengths in order to strengthen your Seder. I'll give you one example of that I learned from a rabbi who's a Reform rabbi in Los Angeles. He was hired many years ago to be the rabbi at Temple Hollywood. And he came into a congregation in which it was expected that everybody would run their Seders. He would run a public Seder in which all kinds of famous people from Hollywood would come instead of home Seders. He was totally opposed. He said, I don't want people to have a Seder as a public event. I want them to do it home. So he decided that he would put as little effort as possible into the Seder that he was planning, the public Seder. And he said it'll be a flop, and then the congregation will understand they have to do their own home Seders. Well, he's sitting there. There's about 300 people there. He hasn't really come up with any good ideas. There's one table in the back, no one's sitting. And in the middle of his Seder, in walk Marlon Brando, not Jewish, along with Bob Dylan, definitely Jewish, and a Native American chief. And suddenly he himself got stage fright. I've planned nothing for the Seder, and Bob Dylan and Marlon Brando are at my Seder. Later on, he found out they were also high from marijuana at the same time. I don't know how much they paid attention. And then he thought to himself, and this is, I think, what my father thought as well, how do I take the talents of these people, which it's not in Judaica clearly, and bring it to the Seder and enrich it? So the first thing he did was to ask Marlon Brando with his deep voice to read the English translation of the Kiddush. And that really added to the quality. And then he had his chazanit, the cantor, run and bring a guitar and hand it to Bob Dylan and have him blow, about the revolution and about blowing in the wind and knowing things have to change. So look around the people at your Seder, the ones you're going to invite. What are their talents? Give them a chance to show that talent, to feel this is their Seder, and that you are the symphony leader who are simply calling on them, now a solo, now this, a kind of a jazz style Seder, which has organization, but also allows people to work on solos, perhaps solos they've already prepared in advance. And each one, therefore, as Zoom does automatically for us, immediately brings them to the center and allows them to make their contribution. We'll come back to that later. The last thing in my father's Seder that I want to comment on is that the last of his directions was, the one who steals the afikoman will be court-martialed. And my father's sense of humor in the Seder is also a really important part of what you want to plan in your Seders. Now, what of course made the Seder in 1948 so powerful was not the wine and not Shmuel Yosef Aganon and not my father's jokes, but something that was unsaid but was obvious. And that is that my father is in 1948 with soldiers who are fighting for the independence of the state of Israel. That historic context gave it tremendous meaning. If Pesach ends every Seder with next year in Jerusalem, with we used to be slaves and now we're going to be free. We used to be in the exile and now we're in Eretz Israel. That was exactly what they were doing. And they realized that the success of their military efforts with God's help would determine what would the next year be, or whether there would be a continuation of the genocide, which had only ended 3 years earlier in 1945. And so I think in that same way, we have to think about what makes this Seder historic and try to bring that into our Seder. It shouldn't dominate the whole Seder, we'll talk about later, but I do think it has an important place. So let me share with you, and we'll hope that screen sharing does its job. Okay, what happened? Didn't happen. Let's try again one more time. I know it's there. There we go. Okay, Seder in time of the plague. So here's some of my reflections on things about Seder in the historic period that we're in. Okay, so let me start with the following thing. The first thing is I think that Seders are radically different today when it comes to the 10 plagues. If you'll remember, not very long ago, certainly for me in 2019, when I came to the plagues, and of course, Rav Claudia saw that, my wife would do all kinds of funny things about plagues, because plagues are so far away. Our sense of the empathy with the Egyptians might be there in principle, but we don't even think of the plague as something serious. So one of the things my wife would do is she would have, she has 10 bottles, leftover coffee bottles, and in each one she puts a symbol of one of the plagues. This is the blood. It's not bud juice, it's the plague. It's a red dye in order to make the water look like blood, and it's something that kids could laugh at. Or of course, I'm sure many of you have put on your Seder plates, you've put frogs, and so we have a whole bag of frogs. But there's no way that this year we can take the plagues with that same lightheartedness that we did before, because this has been a real plague, and it is not a plague that is over when we look at the worldwide situation. And therefore, we should think about the way in which this Seder is like the original Seder. We are closer to the experience of the original Seder which was held during the 10th plague, during the plague of the firstborn, than we have ever been before, not in history, because Jews have lived through many plagues and been affected by those plagues, but for the first time, I think, in most of our lives, short or long, we've had to face this kind of a crisis. Nobody is old enough to remember, I think, the Spanish flu of the people on the Zoom today. So one of the things I would suggest is to begin your Seder by going back to Exodus 12. That's, in fact, the description of the first Seder. It's something that's read in the synagogue leading up to Pesach. And I think a lot of the things we can begin to discuss what's similar and what's different from that original Seder. The first thing is Exodus 12 is filled with public safety announcements by Moses, something I'm sure you're all very used to at this point. And I imagine that the Jews, like many of the people I know in Israel, we don't so much trust these public safety announcements from Netanyahu or from whatever health director is giving those advice. The advice keeps changing. And the first piece of Moses' advice was stockpiling. So he said, everybody should take a lamb. Here we even have a sample from the lamb. Everybody should take a lamb. And with that lamb, they should keep it and prepare for it, make sure they have enough food, and be willing to share it with the neighbors next to them. Then the next stage of the announcements were to make sure your doors are sealed because the angel of death is outside. And therefore, there's a special Seder menu with barbecued meat, with lamb chops, if you will, shawarma, if that's something you like, along with bitter herbs and matzah. And the door, keeping the door locked, becomes a central part of what it means to have a Seder. And I think we've understood that in the last year better than ever before. Suddenly, the door is not just a place to open it up to welcome guests. A door really is what protects us from what's outside. So whenever I have a delivery from the supermarket, and now I don't go to the supermarket, it's only deliveries, then I always make sure when the door is knocked on to look out, say, is the person wearing a mask? Am I wearing a mask? I step away from the door when I open it. I ask him to put all the objects on the floor, and I'll take them so he doesn't come into my house. Suddenly the door that in Egypt had blood on the lintels and blood on the place of the mezuzot, suddenly that becomes the place of in and out, of danger and of safety. And so social distance really is breaking up the sense of community. And instead of a house being a place for hospitality, a house becomes a refuge that has to be locked down. In Israel, we've already had our 4th lockdown. And even during Purim, which was after the lockdown, we had a strict curfew after 8:30 p.m. Everybody had to be home. They did not want Purim parties as much as possible. And so that's the lockdown also during the original Seder, not to go out of the door all night long. There was also a special dress code, not the dress code of wearing a mask, but the dress code of eat it with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, your staff in hand. In other words, you're about to go on a trip. And the mood of that first Seder was not a joyous one. Eat it in chipazon, which means not only haste, but it means trembling and fear. It's the Seder in which we don't know what's going to be the next day. We may have an exodus as promised. Maybe we won't. We will have to go into the desert and we have no idea how that's going to be. Are the Egyptians going to come running after us? So that uncertainty around the lockdown is a central part of what a Seder is. But already in the first Seder, the Jews were looking beyond that Seder, and Moshe was preparing them for what would happen the year after. Because this is a Seder in which we're sort of in between. It's not clear, are we AC after Corona, or are we still in the middle of Corona? And in many ways, you're much more in the middle than we are, but we are as well. And so as we think about the future, we have to begin to ask the question, how are we going to take our experiences and what we've learned from these experiences and translate them into further generations? So my wife, this weekend, when we had 4 of our grandchildren staying over, she discovered the 12-year-old, the 10-year-old, and the 8-year-old having a conversation, talking about what an unusual year it's been For example, my granddaughter who just switched to junior high school, and she said, this whole year, I've only been in junior high school for 12 days. I only had 12 days at the beginning of the year to go to school. The rest has been on Zoom. And today she went back for the first time. And she said, how am I going to explain that to my children, that there was a whole year of school in which school was almost all by Zoom? And so that's exactly the conversation that the Bible imagines. And when in future generations, your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them it's the Passover sacrifice of the Lord who passed over or protected or skipped over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. 3 different meanings of the word Pesach, and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. And so that's one thing for you to think about. Can I perhaps at my Seder read about this tradition, this original Seder, and ask myself, what experience have I had that I want to convey down the line 5 years from now, 10 years from now, of the uniqueness of this particular Seder? In general, just like my father had a unique Seder in 1948, so we're all having a unique Seder in 2020, 2021, and that's something for us to imagine. What did I learn from it, and how would I convey that future? In fact, an activity I've already assigned to my 12-year-old granddaughter is to make a list of all of the curses that go with Corona, all different kinds. In fact, for many of those curses are the curses that especially affected women. So from a feminist point of view, this has been a period worldwide in which women have lost jobs much more than men, in which women have been expected very often to both take care of the children as they're on Zoom school and at the same time continue to work. And the conflict between them has been very great. For my daughter, Tanya, who's a very good friend of Claudia, this is her first year teaching at the Hebrew University, of course, only on Zoom. It's the beginning of the countdown for 6 or 7 years for her to publish enough articles in order to get tenure. And of course, it's a year in which she hasn't been able to write any articles. Have the universities made room for that? No. And so there'll be an enormous gap between her having lost a year, maybe even a year and a half, and whether the universities will ignore the fact that she has children, that women have especially difficult tasks to be both professionals and women. So this is a time for us to think about what the curses of Corona have been. Let me give you an example of something my wife did. Okay. This is a Seder plate, a Corona Seder plate she created. Obviously has an Israeli touch to it. So here you have a little toy ambulance with a Magen David for all the people being sent to the hospital, the Alco-Gel, which is our version of sort of hand washing, the thermometer, which every time I went to the Hartman Institute between the lockdowns, they immediately checked my temperature. Speed, there's distance limits. You could only walk during the lockdowns a maximum of 0.5 kilometer or a whole kilometer from your home. The masks that they wore. Of course, a bottle we found across the street of Corona beer. And my wife has, for each one of the roles of the song Haggadah, about the little goat, she has finger puppets, which we purchased in Peru. And this is the finger puppet she uses for the angel of death in the Haggadah story. So if you could imagine for yourselves having that kind of a Seder plate, what would you put on it, either in imagination or actually assign somebody to put together that and try beginning to get a distance from all of the techniques that we have learned in order to deal with this. Let's go back and look at 2 other things having to do with, okay. So back to the coronavirus. Let's look at a second thing that's very important. Pesach in general is a holiday of family reunion. It's when our most distant relatives come. It's the most greatest variety. It's particularly important to be intergeneration, parent, child, grandchild. It doesn't matter whether you're religious. It doesn't even matter if you're Jewish, but it's a time to get together. From a halachic point of view, Jews that did not celebrate Pesach every single year with the sacrifice in the temple, their punishment was karet. They were cut out of the Jewish people. Some people even say cut out of life, because Pesach is, if you will, it's a renewal of your membership in the Jewish family. And anybody who says, I don't have time to come home for Pesach this year, is a person who's saying that my family is less important. Now, you don't have to be at home all the time for family, but Pesach is the one time to check in and show you're really a member. But social distancing has made that almost impossible. The other aspect of Pesach is that Pesach was a pilgrimage holiday of everybody going up to the temple. And not many of you have been in your temple for over a year. And even now, maybe there's a hope that parts of it will open up in the future. So the denial of the mass pilgrimage aspect, the denial of the family reunion. True, Zoom does allow us perhaps to have relatives from all over the world attending the same Seder if they can make the times work out. But it's still a very qualitatively different form of being together than when you can hug people and see people in shmooze. So I would say the special mitzvah in a time of such loneliness and social distancing is the mitzvah of shalom bayit, of bringing together people and bringing peace into your home. And therefore, if you haven't already done it, to make a list of everybody you want to speak to face on Zoom in the next 2 weeks. Each one of those people you would have had maybe a warm personal conversation with at the Seder, but you won't have that. Have that. If it's parents, if it's children, if it's nephews and nieces, a chance to give them a special blessing that you can't necessarily give this year. And where relationships are strained, to think about the importance of healing those relationships. That, in fact, is what one of the meanings of Elijah. So I'm going to go to the very end where we have Elijah. And let's go back here. Number 8, I think it's going to be. Well, I'll just remind you of it. When Elijah comes, the hope is that Elijah will bring the hearts of the sons and the hearts of the parents back together again from both sides of the relationship, daughters and sons and parents. And so anything you can do to heal damaged family relationships now, I think, is a particular mitzvah on Pesach. Okay? Now let's take a look at a third key element, I think, that comes with this holiday. And that is the specific problem of being happy. If you think back to 2019, a long time ago, it didn't take much to take our freedom, our prosperity, our physical security for granted. To say that Pesach should be a happy Pesach was a self-evident notion. But I think that we don't take that freedom, our freedom of mobility, for granted any longer. We don't take our prosperity for granted, or even our physical security. We certainly do not trust our governments as much as after this experience as perhaps we took for granted democracy and modernity and modern medicine. We certainly are aware, again, stronger than ever, of the inequality and the injustice of vulnerability, including vulnerability to corona and the access to vaccinations. It's a period in which joy doesn't come as a self-evident part of our lives. And therefore, which fits a conversation I just had with Claudia about the curse of loneliness, which is, of course, always a problem in society, especially in modern society, but especially in our period. So I would ask you to think about this year and to think about the need to overcome sadness and to admit our own sadness and our own loneliness. And here I think Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav can help us. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, a man who was very depressive, who died young, who had many different illnesses. Rabbi Nachman made the attempt to overcome your sadness a central one. So here's what he writes. Know that one sunk in Marash Chora depression cannot control his mind freely. It's hard for him to settle his mind and maintain peace of mind. So here's a time for us to think about the dark moments we and members of our family and our community have had, and to make the mitzvah of Pesach a mitzvah that's a conscious one, not spontaneous joy. Rabbi Nachman teaches us only by means of joy can he control his mind and freely and achieve mindful composure. For joy means liberty. And by means of joy, we become free beings and we are enabled to go out from exile. For Rabbi Nachman, every single generation has its own slavery and exodus, and every life has its own slavery and exodus, and every moment has its moment of constriction and limitation with the possibility of exodus. And so his commandment is the mitzvah to be joyful at every moment, fighting against our own inner depression. And therefore, we have to look around and say, how do I make people happier? I just heard a wonderful podcast, and they talked about the fact that usually psychologists say that the majority generally sets the tone. The individual always has to fit himself in with the group. But actually, they said, there are certain kinds of negative behavior by an individual in a group, which actually is contagious. So if you have a group of people who are working on a project together, and one person is a sluggard, somebody who won't participate and who poo-poos the whole significance of the common project, then over time, and they did this in exams, that will shape the atmosphere of all of the people working. It'll take them a lot longer to get work done. If you have somebody who's always being sad, and then that person will also, his sadness is communicable. And so on this holiday, we have a special mitzvah to be happy, not as a natural expression, but as an artificial attempt to make ourselves happy, to communicate that joy, to communicate our care for other people, and therefore to raise the whole atmosphere. Now, how do you do such a thing as that? It's not really a time in which everything is so happy. And therefore, I would suggest we take a look at Dayenu for a moment and ask if Dayenu can change in a slightly way. This is also an assignment I gave to a different one of my grandchildren to work on this project. Dayenu. Dayenu is about counting our blessings when our blessings are only partial. If you remember the song of Dayenu, it goes through each one of the things that God has given us. God has given us, he took us out of Egypt. God took us in the desert and gave us manna. God ultimately took us to the land of Israel, and after that finally opened up a temple for all of us to gather. And yet we say, Dayenu, it would have been enough if only one of those things had come. So I'm sure you can imagine how we could take this and take this holiday and talk about what is the elements that I have to be thankful for. It's obviously an exercise in how is the glass half full, not half empty. I imagine that for me and for many of us, the very first thing on that list of Dayenu will be Dayenu for having Zoom. Dayenu when my internet connections work. And those are not just jokes anymore. Those are really essential to our survival. And therefore, it's really in the spirit of Abraham Joshua Heschel. Basic to human existence is a sense of indebtedness to society, of indebtedness to God. What is emerging in our age is a strange inversion. Modern people believe the world is indebted to them, that society is charged with duties toward them. Their standard and preoccupation, what will I get out of life? Suppressed is the question, what will society get out of me? And I think if our Dayenu is a list of the things we're happy with, and also a list of the people that we feel indebted to, who did things for us, where you specifically, each individual at the table talks about that indebtedness. And I think a fair amount of that indebtedness for you will be indebtedness to people in TBZ and to the whole attempt to create a sense of community under these difficult conditions. Let me end with one last idea related to a Corona Seder, one that I just discovered now, from Abraham Joshua Heschel, from a poem he wrote when he was very young. All right. Let's see if we can find it. There it is. Share. So when Avram Yoshua Heschel was a student, he wrote some very powerful emotional poems in which he works out a very upset and angry in some ways relationship to God. Later, Abraham Joshua Heschel is known, of course, for his work with Martin Luther King, for his opposition to the war in Vietnam, for his struggle for the liberation of Soviet Jewry. And this is the poem that when I read it, written sometime in the 1920s, I suddenly said, this is a poem that I want to read at my Seder. So let me see if I can make this bigger, make it easier to read. Send me, let me see, is this the one? The second one. Millions of eyes choke on one teardrop. Millions of eyes choke on one teardrop, endless troubles due to the entangled fates. God, give me your sword to sunder Gordian knots, brambling the divine loom of every man's destiny. No, I do not wish to bear your fists. I only beg of you, tell every virus, thou shalt not kill. Forbid disasters to run amok. Banish bloodthirst in man and in beast. Hang me as a danger sign above the earth's volcanoes, and set as sentry your own self at the pores of living skin, so no disease will dare enter. I also bear the weight of damage caused by you. Feel, I challenge you. Feel, I challenge you. Like we, like me. If not, I warn you, God, I will make the rounds and scream for all to know that God forgot his heart in me. And that Heschel's heart is the replacement for God, and perhaps also the representative of God. Okay, let me stop at this point, see if there's any questions or comments, and then we'll go on to talk about some more ideas.
Please feel free to unmute if you want to ask some questions or comment, or use the chat, whatever works for you. Would love to hear your voices, though. Okay. Susan and Steve, you're going to ask something there?
Ask. You can ask. I unmuted you.
You're muted. Good.
Can you come? This has been wonderful. Can you comment a little bit about how we should deal with the Vehisha Amda?
Okay. Okay. So one of the key elements of the Seder, I'll give you the big picture, and then I'll tell you how I use Vehisha Amda, though I don't quite know what your issue is, right? When people say, what about Vehisha Amda? You must have something that's bothering you that I have to understand better to answer it, right?
Yes, I mean, it is a debate we have in our family about the fact that this prayer rings home that we have always been the victim. And in every age they rose up against us. It can instill fear. It certainly was what I heard as a child, that we have to always be wary. It's, in that sense, ethnocentric.
Okay. Well, does it instill fear, or does it do the opposite? I think its purpose is Vehisha Amda, the Vehi is the promise that God made to take care of the Jewish people is there. It doesn't matter how dark things look, and they will look dark. That's something we have to be aware of. The truth is that I think the most important thing I learned from Corona, but I also learned it from things like the Yom Kippur War, is I learned that we are vulnerable. I also learned it from Iran, right? The fact that they're developing an atom bomb. I think that it's not that we are inserting fear into people who wouldn't otherwise have fear, but I think in many ways we're not aware of how vulnerable we are politically, economically, medically. And therefore, the Vihi She'amda is an admission that while most of what Pesach is about is a celebration of the past, 3,200 years ago, we were slaves, but none of us are slaves today, of course. And then God took us out from slavery. Let's celebrate, let's eat, let's reenact that experience, acting it out, having fun things with the 10 plagues. The Vihi She'amda is, for me, the most realistic part of the Seder. It's the part that says, no, we are continually in danger. Now, the question is, who is the we that's in danger? Is it only ethnocentric? Is it saying that all other peoples are our enemies or not? Which goes to the part at the end of the Seder about pour out your wrath on those who have eaten Israel alive. Is that meant to be everybody in the world? So you can use it to create, that's what you're afraid of, a sense that we're alone in the world, we can't trust anybody, and therefore we have to put fences around ourselves, lock our doors, the blood on the doorpost, right? That has been the response of many people in the world and many countries in the world towards Corona. Time for us to lock our lockdown. We still have a lockdown in Israel on our airports, to see everybody on the outside as people who are bringing in diseases or now mutations of the disease. We have the South African and the British and the New York one, which are in each one more dangerous. But we don't have to take our response to danger as being therefore distrust. It can be the opposite. Vihi She'amda says we still have hope. We still believe that things can be better. We still believe there are things we can do. So let me respond to it in two particular ways. The first one will have to do with hope. So I'm going to open up a different text because I think that the text in the Haggadah moves us from troubles on the way to greater hope. And therefore, I think, and this is, of course, exactly where all of us are at in 2021. It's not 2020. 2021, we're just on the border of being able to forget about the danger. But I don't want us to forget about the danger. If you forget the danger, first of all, you expose yourself. This is not the last virus. This is not the last time the medical system fails. It's not the last time governments have made things worse. It makes us aware of how far we have to go in order to get to where we're going. But in order to overcome the ethnocentric interpretation of it, let me send you to a poem, which is in my Haggadah, but it's also in the Corona Seder planner, which I think was sent to everybody, right, Rav Tiferet? Everybody got all these extra sources that I sent out. I hope you'll take advantage. So take a look at this source. And I appreciate the question a great deal. Okay. This is a source at the very end of the Haggadah, the point of the Haggadah in which I think we're all talking about hope in one way or another, the hope that whatever problems we still have can be solved. And here is what Rav Abraham Isaac Kook, one of the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel and a great mystic, writes. Songs of the soul, the nation, humanity, and the cosmos. He's taking the notion of the love poem, Song of Songs, and identifying those love songs as love songs that happen on 4 different levels to all of us. They're all about solidarity, about growing solidarity. And here's this is the beginning of his poem. There is one who sings the song of his soul, discovering in it everything, utter spiritual fulfillment. There is a sense in which we can discover within ourselves that each soul includes a whole world, and we can be enough for ourselves. Maybe the ultimate response to loneliness is, first of all, to discover how rich we are internally, and that's a song to sing. Then there is one who sings the song of his people, emerging from the private circle of his soul, not expansive enough, not yet tranquil. He strives for fierce heights, clinging to the entire community of Israel in tender love. Together with her, he sings her song, feels her anguish, delights in her hopes. He conceives profound insights into her past, her future, deftly probing the inwardness of her spirit with the wisdom of love. For him, the first stage, what could be called ethnocentric, is the first stage of concentric circles of solidarity. And he finds in the struggle it takes for an individual to care about others, to care about the family, and then to care about the extended family of the community, and then the extended family of the people, he finds something rich there. That richness opens up the next level of the soul. Then there is one whose soul expands until it extends beyond the border of Israel, singing the song of humanity in the glory of the entire human race, in the glory of the human form. His spirit spreads, aspiring to the goal of humankind, envisioning its consummation. From this spring of life, he draws all his deepest reflections, his searching, his striving, his vision. And then there's another one. Then there is one who expands even further until he unites with all existence, with all creatures, with all worlds, singing a song with them all. Not an easy thing on Zoom to sing together. Then there is one who ascends with all these four songs in unison: the song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity, the song of the cosmos, resounding together, blending in harmony, circulating the sap of life, the sound of the holy joy. This full comprehensiveness rises to become the song of holiness. That's what the sacred is. The song of God, the song of Israel, in its full strength and beauty, in its full authenticity and greatness. The name Yisrael, he gives a new interpretation to it, means Yashir El, God will sing, which is the basis of the song at the Red Sea that Miriam sang. It stands for the song of God, sung originally at the Red Sea, but projected into the future as a comprehensive song. It's a simple song, a twofold song, a threefold song, a fourfold song, whose name, if I can move this, is the Song of Songs, the songs of God. Now, that's a rather long answer for you, but it's what I feel deeply, that vulnerability and fragility don't have to lead to, circling the wagons and locking your door, although sometimes that's an important thing to do temporarily. It can also lead at the very same time to a sense of our interdependence and our interrelatedness, especially with a disease, which is the very proof of globalism, the very proof of the need to be members, as thankfully the United States is again a member of the international health community, because of we're all somehow together. It's not either or that we have to choose, the very opposite. We need to have that multiple songs, and at different times we'll emphasize different ones.
Thank you. That is very helpful.
Okay. The Hisha Amda, there's a promise, and it's a messianic promise to us all, although we have to do something about it, as Heschel said. Let me take a look at a new thing I'd like to share with you, and I'll have to wear a different hat for this purpose. And this is my hat as a chef of international cooking. But I'm not so good on recipes in the sense of food, but I'm quite good at recipes for party planning. And here we have a party, we have a Seder to plan. And the Haggadot that I've created and the Seder planners, which I sent to Rav Tiferet, I hope all of this will be online for you to share, are ways in which you can begin to shape your own Seder and customize it. You have to, of course, customize. Every Seder needs to be customized. Corona just forces us to think about it more explicitly. I am totally opposed to those people who say, I don't have to prepare my Seder, except for the food and the cooking, until the night we all get together. We'll open up the book, turn to page 1, and you read, you read, you read. That is not my notion of what a Seder was ever meant to be. It's a homemade Seder, and it's a homemade Judaism. And you have to make choices within the realistic situation you're in, and also find the special advantages you have. For example, Zoom connecting us with people who might not, even if we were all healthy, come together for a common Seder. So let me share a little bit of the booklet that I also sent to share with you. Okay. Okay. Is this the one? Nope, that's the wrong one. Sorry, let me try again.
I posted it's a Google folder that has everything. So you'll have it after, you can look at everything. I think it's going to be very helpful for all of us.
Great. Okay, let me try one more time how I'm going to do this. Okay, share. The complications of Zoom. Here it is. Okay. Okay, I'm going to walk you through the Haggadah in the short period we have, because it's a big mitzvah to spend, to prepare Pesach 30 days in advance by going through the various halachot, and especially to read the story of, to read from the Haggadah, especially in the days leading up to Pesach. And it seems to me, I'd like to point out 6 major stops on the Haggadah trail from slavery to freedom. Because the very structure of Pesach is a structure of the Seder, is a dramatic structure that goes mi gnut l'shvach. It goes from a bad situation.
We are seeing your folder organizers. We're not seeing the.
Okay, we did this wrong. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, try to share again. And now, here it is. Thank you. Thanks for the advice. And now let me make it bigger. So, as I hope you will do, I hope you're going to sit down and say, well, let me prepare the Seder. Not just the food, which of course is very important, but actually the food is much easier this year, at least for us. Last year we had a 6-hour Seder with our family, but it was only 2 people at home. And when I did the dishes, I really felt the difference of having so few dishes to do. So in some ways, there's less work for this Seder, less work of cooking and certainly of cleaning in my judgment, but there's a lot more room for working and spending your time on preparing the Seder. And so I would identify 6 major content steps on your Seder, beginning with slavery and ending up with freedom, beginning with fear and ending up with hope. So the first stop is from the bread of poverty and brokenness to tzedakah and healing. Then there's arousing questions. Then there's telling the story, we were slaves. Then including both political, economic, and spiritual, psychological liberation. There's the 4 children. There's the symposium, in which we have to discuss the ways in which oppression works and where do people get the resources for resisting oppression. And last but not least, and that I'll put the major emphasis on, next year in Jerusalem, how do we have an element of hope and hatikva? For some of you who've had short Seders that ended with the meal, you've never gotten to that last part of next year in Jerusalem. This year, for sure, you got to get to the end, because it's the end which offers us our hope. So let me do a little bit on the beginning and a little bit on the end. So step number 1. At the very beginning of the Seder, there is a short section called halach ma'anya. This is the bread of poverty or persecution. And in fact, this is the mini Seder, all of it in one paragraph. It begins with the past. This is the bread of poverty and persecution that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Notice, it's not talking about the matzah we ate when we were escaping from Egypt, which was the matzah of freedom. We're talking about the matzah we ate in Egypt. As it says, 7 days you shall eat matzot, the bread of poverty and persecution, so that you will remember that you were a slave in Egypt. That's that first bread that we eat. And then it moves from the past to the present, to moral solidarity. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and share the Passover meal. That's the next step, which is absolutely essential here. We cannot sit down to eat until we make sure that other people have something to sit down and eat. And something does not only mean food, it also means a place to be at the Seder. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, why do we have these two phrases, let all who are hungry come and eat? That's the need for food. Let all who are in need come and share the Pesach meal. All the people who don't have anybody to celebrate with need to have somebody to celebrate with. So that's our next step. That's our moral solidarity. And I would suggest that each one of you, I'm sure you do it already, but each one of you, make sure that everybody invited to your Seder, whether it's on Zoom or real, make sure they make a contribution to tzedakah for the immediate needs of people on this Passover, their food needs, their emotional needs. And at the very beginning of the Seder, go around and ask, did you bring your ticket for entrance? Did you bring a tzedakah certificate? They don't have to tell you how much money they gave, but who did they give the money to? And why did they choose that tzedakah? And of course, tzedakah is not only done with money, it's also done with volunteer work. And so if you go around and ask each person, what volunteer work did you do over the last Corona year that's been contributing to making people who are alone be able to celebrate and to feel wanted and connected? And you'll discover such amazing things about people. What I want is, don't let the Haggadah and the emphasis on the ancient take all of our attention. Let's make sure to go back and forth between remembering the past and being in the present and talking about how each one of us is contributing to the liberation of ourselves and others during this time of need. And then the end of this short paragraph, it's the end of the whole Haggadah again. This year we are still here. Next year in the land of Israel. This year we are still slaves. Next year, free people. We have to move from the poverty to the hope. So let's look a little bit more at some ideas about what to do with the poverty part. Okay? And you can see here, I've put in the page numbers from the Night to Remember Haggadah and the A Different Night Haggadah and a Seder supplement. So you'll have lots of things to choose from. And in preparing your Seder, delegate, as I've tried to delegate to my grandchildren, as many things as you can. So each person will be bringing a different part of the Seder. Somebody will bring something on the four children. Somebody will bring something different on the storytelling, something different on a symposium about oppression and injustice. And thereby, you've involved many people in creating this Seder. Again, as I said, you're the jazz leader telling people when to come in. So these references you can offer them to the people at your Seder so they could prepare it in advance. Specifically, I love an idea that Mishael, my son, invented many years ago. And that is to take the matzah and to have everybody hold their own matzah in their hand. So if you have 10 people, 10 matzahs. And they're all going to break the matzah. But the moment before they break it, they have to think to themselves and they have to say, what in my life, personally, in my family, or beyond, is broken in the world? And then everybody together making that crunching sound, break the matzah in half. Half of it, of course, is to be eaten at the beginning of the Seder, and the other half is for the afikoman at the very end. This is the personalizing part of a Seder. I'm sure you've done in many different ways. What is broken in your life and that of our society in the year of Corona and other tragedies? What are the narrow straits of your life in your personal Mitzrayim? What new opportunities or aspects of yourselves have broken open this year? Right? Now, here's what Rav Soloveitchik's explanation that I already gave you orally, so I don't have to read it. Then we have questions, and now I'm going to go to the very end of the Seder. And at the very end of the Seder, the last stop is the next year in Jerusalem spot. And there's many, many different things in the Haggadot that I've put together that one could use. Let me suggest a custom I learned from the Hasidic Rebbe Naftali Ropshitz. At the moment before we open the door for Elijah, when we fill up the very big cup for Elijah, what he would ask is for everybody, not a very hygienic technique, but still a good idea, to take a little bit of the wine in their personal cups and pour it into the cup of Elijah. I guess Elijah can drink all of those without worrying about infection. And as you do that, talk about what your hopes are for next year and what you can do to make those hopes come true. His notion was that the redemption comes not just from God sending the Messiah, but hitorut diltata. It has to begin from below, and therefore we have to pour the wine into Elijah's cup in order to invite Elijah to come to us. And then there are many beautiful texts you can use. You'll see in the materials we sent you, there's a piece from Anna Frank, and the fact that in 1944, she's talking about the fact that we can always have hope because we can always make the world a better place, even in 1944 in Amsterdam, hiding in her attic in Amsterdam. And then one of my very favorite pieces of hope, especially goes with opening the door for Elijah, is Michael Walzer in his book Exodus and Revolution. The door of hope is still open. For many of us, it's a question of opening that door because we still are living in a world of closed doors. The door of hope is still open. Things are not what they might be, even when what they might be isn't totally different from what they are. We still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Egypt is not only an ancient history, it's contemporary political and economic history. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land, not to give up. And third, and most important, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. We're going to go through hard times, all right? Even if next year people do have vaccinations, it'll take a long time, as President Biden has said, before we reconstruct the economy and reconstruct our society and try to make up for some of the long-term damage that has been caused by this. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. It's that togetherness which we have to commit ourselves to. Now, one of the things that you now have at your access because of the inauguration, certainly something that I was incredibly impressed with, is Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem. Now, it's a little bit long to do at the end of your Seder, but if you assign somebody to pick a couple of stanzas, which are about hope, hope facing pain, hope through pain. Maybe you can even learn some of the hand motions that Amanda Gorman did when she performed the song that she wrote. Then I think in a sense, we'll have a way of reflecting on our hope. At the end of the Haggadah that I did with my son, Michel, the night to remember, we asked the artist, Michel Kishka, to do a drawing of next year in Jerusalem. This was his drawing. He decided to create a new gate in the city of Jerusalem, the gate of peace. There are many gates, but no gate of peace. But he imagines that sometime we can break open a new opening, and that will be the gate of peace. He imagined Theodor Herzl looking down at the society that's been created in Israel with a frown on his face and his utopian book, The Jewish State, in his hand and saying, is this what I had in mind? Not really. And here we have the symbols of peace, the dove, the olive tree. And what he did in this picture is he decided to take every aspect of Israeli society, and mutatis mutandis, you can think about American society and American Jewish society, and talk about what are the things tearing that society apart, and could we imagine them being different? So for example, since Israelis are going to celebrate, I hate that word, celebrate the Pesach by having another election, our fourth election, I guess to go along with our fourth lockdown, in which who knows what the results are going to be. And the right and the left are more divided than ever. So in Israel, the football teams are sponsored by the political parties, at least they were originally. So he imagines that two football teams that compete representing the Likud party and the Labor Party, they can actually sit together and they can hug, they can shake hands together. Or a mitnachel, a West Bank settler, A religious Zionist can get together with an Arab, a Palestinian nationalist Arab, who's wearing the keffiyeh, which is a symbol of the Palestinian Liberation Front, and they can have coffee together. And our Messiah will be a hippie who is red bearded, because David is supposed to have red beard or red skin, coming on a white donkey, and a period in which Isaiah promises us that the predator animals and the victim animals, the prey, will get along. In this case, the wolf, and it's supposed to be the lamb, but unfortunately our artist got it mixed up, and so he did a goat instead of a lamb. And then you can see in the background, through the gates, you can see the only Haggadah I know that has a symbol of the Muslims, a symbol of the church, a cross, and a symbol of the Magen David, with the hope that all those groups will be able to get along together. Unfortunately, he put the mezuzah in backwards because he himself is a non-religious Jew, and he handed us this picture at the very last deadline, and we couldn't even have time to fix it. So imagine for yourselves, what are the parts of your society that will be healed, and that will be the story of hope. Comments, questions, things you'd like to share from what you're doing in your Seders.
Please unmute your. Have any questions or any comments?
Well,
Yes, please.
first of all, thank you. I was at your last presentation, and early in this session, Julie and I chatted with each other of how many years we've been going to these Seder prep classes, and we still can't get it right. Well, I said I still can't get it right. And I love getting these flood of ideas, and then translating them is still such a challenge. So for me, one of the big challenges is having lost the senior generation, my parents, my in-laws, that lent a kind of authenticity and gravitas that my kids somehow don't feel from me, even though towards the end of his life, my father and I led our family Seder together for the last, I would say, 5 or 10 even years of his life. I really still struggle, partly because what feels most potent to me about Seders is the singing together, is the emotional tone. And that phrase, without a kind of critical mass of folks to sing together. So that helps with Zoom because you can't really sing together that well. So one of the challenges, I love the idea of enriching your Seder with the talents of your guests, but I think your guests in general are just way more talented than mine. And, you know, I don't have a Sephardic friend bringing in those melodies. And so I feel such a sense of responsibility. And one of the tensions to me, when you make changes, I've tried making it more freewheeling, opening it up to more discussion. But then I feel, what about the Seder part of a Seder, the ordering of it, that I don't want to lose that adherence to that structure that makes it a Seder. And yet to make it meaningful, I think requires me to loosen up enormously on I can't miss a part, because then I feel like I've blown the Seder.
That is the classic issue. There's no question that you need the basic structure, which is a Seder. But in fact, many of the things in the Haggadah are things that you don't have to do. So what you need to do, you together with whoever else is planning the Seder, is to make a list. And that's why we sent out these Seder planners, to pick what are the things which are the scaffold. The cups of wine, I assume. The hors d'oeuvres, I assume. Halachma'anya, this is the bread of poverty. The 4 questions or questioning. And then the storytelling. and then some sort of discussion about freedom and slavery, which doesn't have to be from within the Haggadah, although in our Haggadot, there are many examples of conversations you could have. And then you want to do a little bit of Hallel, not the whole thing, but one of those songs, B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, one of them could be enough. And then, of course, you're going to have the food, the matzah, the maror, and so on. And then at the end, after the meal, and you definitely have to have after the meal, you're going to have the Afikoman, and you're going to have Elijah, and you're going to have next year in Jerusalem. What I've just listed is not a lot of things. That's the basic structure. Families can have special things they like. And then to add to the gravitas, which is the hardest thing to do. First of all, it's not so clear to me that your parents and had such gravitas. It looked like gravitas to you, but they had to also create that sense of gravitas. I suggest that the gravitas comes from you talking with your friends and with your children about what's so important about being Jewish and why Pesach is such an important part of who I am as a human being and as a Jew. And if you make that explicit, if you say that part of what's going to happen at the Seder is for me to talk about what I received, what is important to me, and then invite other people to share something positive from their Judaism, how it reflects their humanity, how it reflects their values. If you have a conversation in which people talk about values and you use the scaffold of the Seder to do it, then the Seder will have a gravitas. That's why I suggested, for example, for each person to give to its tzedakah and each person to report on something of their volunteer work. Suddenly they're talking about real things that are Pesach, and they're sharing it with each other and they're learning from one another. I think that's really the key element. Create that structure. Now type it up. Type up the menu. What are you going to eat? And maybe in different homes for different Zooms, they'll have different recipes. Who have you assigned to be responsible for each one of these things? Do you have somebody who's an educator in your family, or a social worker, or a psychologist? Give them the 4 children, tell them to pick one of those children and to talk about how do you deal with a special needs child, or how do you deal with a person who's feeling alienated and rebellious, or how do you deal with the gifted child, and to do a little talk using the 4 children to talk about that, and then invite other people's opinions. How did you handle if you had a couple of particularly bright children or particularly challenging kids during a certain period of their life? Talk about that challenge and then ask for advice on that. And you can have a real conversation with people when they suddenly go from the theory of how parents educate children. Sometimes it's dangerous, but if you can, to talk about families and how they handled it. Maybe some of their failures, maybe some of their successes, maybe some of their hopes. Each one of those parts of the scaffold, including hope. What are your hopes and what are your fears? And I would say, especially in a year of Corona, after we've lost so many people, that the first thing at the beginning of the Seder would be, if I could, who would I invite to the Seder who's missing? Missing because of Corona, missing because it's my parents who passed away, missing because I would love to have Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel at my Seder, and invite them to your Seder and have one of the people say, I would like to introduce you to my father, Alav Shalom. I want to tell you about him. Does anybody have any questions about that grandfather? Would you like to hear a couple of his stories about him? Would you like to see a photograph, something that belonged to him? Create, not every single person at the Seder doing it, because the Seder will last for 6 hours, but simply one person whose job it is to introduce you, to introduce somebody who's going to join us at the Seder, who that person is and why he's important to me, etc., etc. Each time have only one person be the person who's responsible. And the person who sings best, everybody can sing on Zoom as long as everybody is on mute. Probably the best trick you can know on Zoom is that there's a great power of a Zoom Seder. You know what that great power is? I can mute people. If you have that person at your Seder who's the one who's always so negative and hurry up, let's eat already, and this is too long and I gotta go. If you have the power to mute them, then you have the supreme power. You have to use it carefully, but you have to make sure that you open up only when you have something positive to add to the Seder. Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. I'm wishing you all really lovely Seders.
My internet is not very good. Something happened. Can you hear me guys well? Yeah?
Yes,
Good.
I can.
You're moving slowly, but I can hear. So much to Noam for his presentation. It makes me him and his family even so much. I wish we were together for Pesach like we have been a few years ago here and in Jerusalem. But I know that I listening to what he had to offer to all of us will definitely enrich all our Sederim. I hope so. You got the links with all the sources. Take time for it. And I like Noam, I think that we've spent so much time cleaning our kitchens and thinking about food, and we spend less time thinking about the content. This is why we created this day. This day, preparing for Pesach beyond your kitchen. That's what we call it. Like instead of spending your whole Sunday cleaning your kitchen, spend your it makes it easier because we have to cook less and we to Pesach. So הבאה בירושלים, או לשנה הבאה, אלה שמירושלים פה בבוסטון, this way or this way, God willing, we'll be together in some place at some point, but so Yasher Koach. Noam, thank you all for being here. We have a 10 minutes break. If you are staying coming to that how to their